All right. Well, hello, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Jonathan was going to introduce me, but you got to love technology, right? Hopefully, all of you can hear me. And I just realized I didn't even put my name on the first slide, so I apologize. But let me tell you who I am. My name is Diana Isaacs. I'm a clinical pharmacist. I'm also the CGM program coordinator at the Cleveland Clinic Diabetes Center, where I work with tons of patients with diabetes all the time, managing their medications. And I also was the 2020 Diabetes Care and Education Specialist of the Year through ADCES. So I've had a great opportunity to be doing some presenting, and I love doing this. And so I'm very excited to talk to you today about a topic called insulin potency and managing glycemia, the role of VIVI CAP. And I'm very excited because I recently learned more about how much this really can impact glucose levels for patients. And I just want to make you aware of it. I actually had the great fortune of being an observer to a USP insulin task force meeting this past week, and many of the issues that we're going to talk today were brought up. And so I think this is a problem that often goes unrecognized, and I'm excited to be able to bring it to you today. So in terms of what we're going to talk about today, so we're going to review factors that impact glucose levels. We're going to describe some of the importance of insulin storage and its impact on insulin potency and how that translates to impact on glucose. And then I'm going to share with you the VIVI CAP as a potential insulin storage solution. So for starters, what impacts glucose levels? And this is a very simplified diagram because there are many things within these that affect glucose levels. So kind of the traditional things that lower glucose, right, are physical activity and medications, anti-hyperglycemic medications, and specifically today, we're spending focus on insulin. Now, what about what raises it, right? So food, specifically carbohydrates, seem to have the biggest impact. And then any kind of stress on the body, whether that's, that is, a sickness type of stress or, the not sleeping well because of COVID. And so it's really a balancing act, trying to get that just right to maintain the glycemic targets in diabetes. So why do we want to achieve glycemic targets? Why do we care at all? Well, there's a whole number of complications that can happen from diabetes. And I want my patients to be aware of these things, but I try not to stress these too much, because the reality is if we can achieve glucose targets, we can avoid these complications and patients can live long, wonderful, healthy lives. But the reality is if glucose levels are not in target, it does put people at increased risk of specifically cardiovascular disease. So that includes like stroke, heart attacks, peripheral vascular disease, also kidney disease, eye disease, and retinopathy. A host of neuropathies can happen. And we know, with neuropathies and increased risk of infection and peripheral vascular disease, that can unfortunately put people at risk of things like amputations, which can be, very scary. Also, gastroparesis, difficulty processing food. In extreme cases of hyperglycemia, we can have ketoacidosis. And then, of course, when insulin's not regulated, we've got the risk of hypoglycemia. So what are some of the considerations in insulin dosing? Well, there are many. So the type of insulin, we know that we have long-acting insulins. Now we have very, very long-acting insulins. We have our regular insulin, our rapid-acting insulin. We even have inhaled insulin now. And certainly the timing of these types of insulin becomes very important in how it's given, what time of day, and in regards to meals or not. The current glucose level, because often, we can allow, increased insulin dosing to correct for a high glucose. The expected meal size and carbohydrate content. So many people are on insulin to carbohydrate ratios where they'll calculate their insulin dose based on how much they're eating. And other people are on set doses where it's very important that they have consistency in the type of meals. The recent activity level, because we know, exercise is actually very interesting. Many times it will decrease glucose, but sometimes intensive exercise like sprinting or lifting weights will sometimes actually increase it initially. And then the impact of other medications, whether that's other glucose lowering medications or medications like steroids, which can actually increase it. And I think the one thing that I know really wasn't center of my mind until more recently was the potency of insulin itself. Like, we are always making the assumption that 1 unit of insulin is 1 unit of insulin. But what if it's not? So I want to introduce to you 2 cases, and we're going to introduce them now, and then we're going to come back to them toward the end of the presentation. So meet Adam. He is a 24-year-old male with type 1 diabetes, and he's wearing a continuous glucose monitor, and he uses insulin pens to manage his diabetes. He's got his long-acting insulin and his rapid-acting insulin. And he went to the beach because it's summer, it's June, it's nice out, and he left his insulin in his car while he was there, and he was there for 3 hours. And it's a bit hot outside. So is it safe for Adam to still take his insulin? What do you think? Is it, should he just use it and carry on? What should he actually do? And I think this is a situation that comes up quite often, and people ask, well, what should I do? So we're going to come back to that. Similarly, now we've got Julia. So Julia is a 45-year-old woman. She has type 2 diabetes. And she takes multiple daily injections of insulin via insulin pens as well. And she also, she's got a long-acting, she's got a mealtime insulin, and she went jogging for an hour in a local forest preserve. She's trying to stay in shape and, be active and everything. And she follows the advice of her diabetes team, which says, you always need to take your insulin with you. You need to take your supplies, your glucometer, take it all with you. So she did, but she didn't want to carry her insulin with her while she's on the run. So she left it in her car. She tried to even park her car in the shade. But as many of you know, sometimes the shade moves depending on the time of the day, right? The sun moves. And so when she got back to her car, her seats were boiling hot to the touch when she finished. So she's wondering, is it safe for her to take her insulin? Her insulin is boiling. Should she take it? Should she not? What should she do? So think about those in the back of your mind, and we'll definitely come back to those. So let's talk about now insulin storage, right? So one of the things with insulin is it's a peptide hormone drug, and that means it's very susceptible to changes in stability when exposed to different environmental factors. As I was listening to this USP insulin task force meeting, one of the comments was, well, why can't we just make more stable insulin that isn't affected by the temperature? It's really difficult to do. It's a peptide hormone. And so if we could do that, we would do it. But we don't have that ability. It is very sensitive to the temperature. And unfortunately, those factors can accelerate the physical and chemical degradation of the insulin. So by properly storing it, it maintains the insulin's potency and allows for precise dosing. And actually, it's so interesting to me how the cold chain, maintaining the temperature, it's very strict, going from when it's manufactured to, brought to the pharmacy. But then once it's out of the pharmacy and it's in the person with diabetes hands, I think there's less guidance about, how it's stored and what to do. And that's when we really have a big problem with the potency. And why this is important is because precise dosing is needed to achieve glycemic targets. Otherwise, we put people at risk of all the complications that we talked about in the beginning. So environmental factors do indeed affect insulin potency. And what are some of these? Well, it includes, very high temperatures, like we saw in the last 2 examples, where it's very common in the summer to reach those temperatures. Similarly, though, very cold temperatures, like if insulin were to, freeze when it's not supposed to. Direct sunlight onto the insulin. Agitation through movement. I had a patient yesterday who was with me, and he had a vial of insulin, and I saw him vigorously shake it. And so this was Novolog. This is a clear insulin that is not supposed to be shaken. And he was shaking it, which allows tons of extra air bubbles to come into it. And he said he's been doing that for 10 years. No one told him you're not supposed to shake that kind of insulin. So that can be a problem. And then increased air liquid surfaces. So when you take something like, for example, a vial of insulin, and there's less in there, a vial holds 1,000 units of insulin. Let's say you're down to your last 10, well, there's a lot more air exposure. And that's why there's expiration dates on insulin, because that can definitely affect the potency of it. So how should insulin be stored? What is the gold standard? So really, before first use, meaning before a person's opened up their pen to start using it for injections, it should be refrigerated. And that's generally going to be 2 to 8 degrees Celsius or 36 to 46 degrees Fahrenheit. And this allows it to maintain the quality until the expiration date that's actually on the vial or the pen. The max temperature should not exceed 46 degrees Fahrenheit, and it should never be allowed to freeze, which I see so many patients like throw their insulin into this ice pack, and it's right next to the ice pack, and that can be dangerous because that now is being allowed to freeze. Now, this is different from once it's opened. Once it's used the first time, it's actually optimal to keep it at room temperature and to not refrigerate it at that point. And so there, you're going to want to maintain a room temperature, below 25 to 30 degrees Celsius. And it should not be allowed to freeze. It should not be allowed to come into direct sunlight. And really, it's not recommended to even put it back in the fridge once it's actually been opened. So what are these expiration dates? Well, I think this gets confusing because once upon a time, I think like most insulins were 28 days and that was easy and that's what we would tell patients. Now it is different depending on the type of insulin. Many still are 28 days. There are actually some that are like 10 to 14 days, the older, like the Novolin N 70/30s. And then now some of our newer type of insulins actually go to 56 days. This is important because for those people that are on let's say very small insulin doses, it means that they're going to need to discard their insulin before they've gotten to use it all, before that expiration date. And another thing to keep in mind is that these expiration dates are designed for when it's used according to the label. So when you actually are, not storing it correctly, these expiration dates go out the window. What maybe would have been 28 days now is not going to be effective for 28 days. So I think insulin storage honestly can be very challenging. Many people, I don't think, get the proper education up front, or what I see is people are educated on diabetes, like they get this 3-hour super class that is supposed to educate them on everything, and it's detailed. They get all the education, but how is a person supposed to remember it without some kind of reinforcement, right? So I think there's a lot of misconceptions out there. Many people think that their insulin always needs to be refrigerated. Many times that is actually a barrier to taking it because someone says, well, I can't keep my insulin cold, or so I'm just not going to carry it with me. And you see the people that really need insulin during the day, but don't take it because of the inconvenience. Similarly, you see people that store their insulin in the refrigerator all the time, and that can actually lead to painful, burning injections. Cold insulin does not feel great, and I find that also can be a barrier to ongoing adherence with insulin. If it's burning, a person's probably less likely to want to keep getting their doses, right? And then of course, people on very small doses, which it's more common in people with type 1 diabetes or someone newly diagnosed. But often, their insulin is going to last longer than how many units are in there in the expiration date, but that if they keep it longer, it's not going to be as effective. And I think, we saw in the 2 examples from earlier with Adam and Julia that, real life happens. It can be kind of hard to follow these recommendations. So when insulin does lose its potency, unfortunately, you usually can't just tell by looking at it. Many times, most of our insulins are clear, and a visual inspection it won't tell you if it's lost, half of its potency. Certainly, if it's a clear insulin and you see like weird little particles floating, that means it's not good. But often you can't really tell. I was very surprised to hear this statistic that the FDA actually allows up to 5% potency to be lost with perfect storage conditions. So what that means is, right, like 100 units of insulin could be 95 units of insulin. And so that's with perfect storage. So you could imagine with less than perfect storage, that's going to go way down. And so an example of this is for a person that's injecting 20 units, if it lost 20% potency, plus adding in the 5%, allowed by the FDA, that means only 15 units are active. So what does that mean when the person goes to inject their insulin glargine 20 units once a day and they're only getting 15, right? That's going to really affect their glucose levels. And then the other thing I see is we see, oh, well, your glucose has gone high, so let's increase the dose, right? We're going to increase it, and maybe we'll increase it to 24 units, and then they get a new pen, and then that 24 throws them into hypoglycemia. So I have a few questions for you. Have your patients ever complained that an insulin pen lost its potency the longer it was used? Because if so, that could be an indication that, you know, something's affecting their potency. And I have heard this before where, you know, someone will say, yeah, when I get to the end of my vial or my pen or my insulin pump cartridge, I notice it's not working as well. Have your patients ever reported needing higher insulin doses the longer they've used a single pen? And, you know, maybe the answer is no, but maybe if you go back to think about it, that this could be happening and maybe your patient wasn't aware of it, you weren't aware of it, but this phenomenon may actually be happening. And then the last one is, have your patients ever reported glucose variability that they couldn't explain from food, activity, or other common causes? I can tell you myself personally, hands down, yes to all three of these things. And now, you know, one of the things I love about diabetes management and, you know, continuous glucose monitoring and glucose checking and all that stuff is there's finding the puzzle, finding the patterns. And sometimes you look at something and you're like, there is no pattern. Like, what is the pattern here? But now this is another tool we have. We should be thinking, is something going on with the insulin potency and can we address that? So our environment, right? The average ambient temperature in many regions is much higher than kind of the typical upper end of the room temperature of 30 degrees Celsius or 86 degrees Fahrenheit. Certainly in the summer here in the United States and Cleveland, it gets very, very hot. Similar in the winter, it gets well below the 2 degrees Celsius or the 36 degrees Fahrenheit. And if you're in a place like me in Cleveland, that can happen in a single month, both extremes, like in May. So we know like our environment has a big impact. The other thing is not everyone has air conditioning, or, you know, even if you have air conditioning, there can be power outages and times where it breaks. Interesting thing that's been happening now with COVID is a lot of newly homeless people. And that's, you know, another challenge with this insulin storage. So what about refrigerators, right? Because we know, like, okay, isn't the solution just throw your insulin in a refrigerator and everything should be fine? So it's true, you know, most household refrigerators are pretty good. Most of them, not all of them. And so they're designed to keep it refrigerated, but keep in mind, our household refrigerators are not the same as, you know, what you would see in a pharmacy or in a hospital where someone's going in and actually checking the temperature every day. Sometimes, I don't know if you've experienced this, but sometimes like I throw something in the back of the refrigerator and then I check it 2 weeks later and it's frozen. So there's certainly, you know, some warm and cold zone things that can happen that can affect the insulin in a refrigerator. And I think probably where this really comes into play a lot though is like, you know, if you're going away, you're staying at a hotel or something and you're using one of those mini fridges, those are kind of notorious to have this extreme temperature variability. And you think about it, like they're so small, you know, you open it, probably all the you know, the cold is lost. And so it's just, there's certainly a lot of opportunities in real life where the insulin may not be, you know, stored exactly the way it's supposed to be. So what are the consequences of inadequate insulin storage? Well, I think for sure, glycemic variability, when you're bouncing around between a pen that has potency versus not, you know, did it lose 5%? Did it lose 15%? Did it lose 50%? The second, though, is wasted insulin. You know, we could go back to those examples from the beginning and say, well, the solution is just throw away the insulin and start a new pen. Well, that would be great if insulin pens were like $1, right? But we know, at least in the United States, insulin is so expensive. People don't want to throw away insulin. And so we need, you know, that's not going to be a great solution. Ketoacidosis. So certainly people with type 1 diabetes or people who have a complete insulin deficiency are going to be exposed to the potential of diabetic ketoacidosis. And then lastly, what about diabetes distress? So that it can be incredibly frustrating having this glycemic variability, not understanding why glucose is up, down. You think you're trying to do what you're supposed to. You're giving yourself your insulin injections. You're carrying your insulin with you on your run to the beach, but things are still not working the right way. And that you can imagine could cause a lot of distress. So speaking of the cost of insulin, right? Oh my gosh, insulin is so expensive. So this, you know, these prices can fluctuate day to day, but these were some, you know, recent prices from the commonly used insulins like Humalog, you know, $530 for a pack of pens, which usually there's 5 pens in a pack and 1,500 units. So, you know, in the 500s, dollars, $100 a pen. I mean, that is a lot of money. And it is true, you know, different companies are doing different things to try to lower the cost, but the programs are not always accessible to everyone, or people aren't aware of the programs. And so the reality is, it is expensive and it's difficult, and we don't want to throw away insulin. And because of that, we're seeing a lot of rationing of insulin. We see people that, you know, are trying to take, you know, they'll hold on to their insulin, even if it's expired, they'll want to hold on to it. I had this super sad case of a mother, and her daughter had diabetes also, and she was cutting off like 25% of her dose so she could give that insulin to her daughter. So, I mean, this is a big problem. All right, so now I want to switch gears. I want to introduce you to the VIVI CAP, which I think at least is one potential solution to address some of this really bigger problem. So this is an FDA registered medical device. It's a replacement cap for disposable and refillable insulin pens. And basically it keeps insulin cool for a minimum of 12 hours in a constant environmental temperature that's over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So this is longer than like what you would expect from daylight, you know, daylight sun time. So it protects insulin from overheating or from freezing. And it's actually, you know, it works for years. It doesn't have any type of maintenance or any type of charging or anything. And then there's also a temperature status indicator that you can, you know, be reassured that the temperature is correct. So let's see what this looks like. I'm going to show you through a few different slides that I think really illustrate this concept, and I even have my demo here. So, so this is, it's called TemperMed, this super insulation, and it's actually used in spacecraft avionics and cryotherapy and other high performance thermal insulation applications. So pretty cool. And so there's a temperature indicator light that tells the insulin temperature status, and then this TemperMed heat absorbing phase changing material, which is commonly used in green construction, that's protecting it. And then the insulin pen is put into there. So it is protecting the inside of a pen. This is a blown up version of it. And so down here at the bottom is the insulin pen. And then here is the VIVI cap, and this is blown up. And so what it's showing is that the outside temperature could be more than 100 degrees Fahrenheit, but this insulin itself is going to be protected to stay below 86 degrees Fahrenheit, which is the upper limit of what's okay for insulin. And then there is this built-in temperature sensor. So that's this green light. So anytime, you know, you want to check on the status, right? Because you want that reassurance that the insulin is working and that it has not overheated. So that green light indicates that the temperature is in the acceptable range. And then that heat absorbing material actually automatically recharges whenever the VIVI cap is back into that ambient temperature, that room temperature. So I think one of the nice things about this is there's not maintenance, there's not charging, and you don't have to like put it in cold water or, you know, anything like that. Okay, I know this is a lot, but I just thought this was cool. It's basically showing like what happens in each of these 24-hour periods, that, you know, the outside temperature could be 100 degrees, right? But the temperature of the insulin is always going to stay in this acceptable range. And then like this nighttime, like you think about it, right? Like if it was in a hot car, you know, that direct sunlight is going to get really hot. And then at nighttime, it cools off a little bit. It allows the VIVI cap to cool off, and then it's going to come back down, and it's never going to get overheated. Like even if you left it in your car for like, I don't know, for days. So I think that's kind of neat. And then this is another like example of it, right? So showing like daytime hours, right? 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. Heat is blocked by the insulation and absorbed. And so like you see in here, the insulin is staying at, you know, the acceptable temperature, even though it's like super hot on the outside. And then at nighttime, it's like kind of like that nighttime is allowing it to be able to recharge. So people don't have to worry about the potency of their insulin. All right, this is a video, so I'm not going to play this now, but certainly I'm sure Jonathan will share with you all the links and websites and all the great things about it. I do happen to have my little, you know, demos right here, which are probably difficult to see, but I just thought it would be kind of cool. There's actually like different ones depending on what kind of pen you have. So this is like a Novolog one, and so like you can see here, this is showing, I don't know, it's like hard to see. This is showing my pen, and then this is showing the size of it. So it's like really lightweight and easy to carry around. So I have like my one for the Novolog, and then I have my one for the Humalog too. And so it's like kind of nice because like it just replaces the cap. So it's like very easy to use, very easy to carry with you, keep in your purse and things like that. All right. So it does work with multiple different types of insulin. So pretty much like whatever type of insulin a person's on, they would just need to get the specific one, whether it's a Novo insulin, a Sanofi insulin, you know, a Lilly insulin, just because the sizes of the pens can be slightly different. So you would just need to get the corresponding one that goes with the type of pen. And then it also actually even works with many of the refillable pens. I mean, we don't have a ton of, you know, most of our patients here are using the disposable, but I know in, you know, some places people are using the refillable ones. And so there's a lot of different options in terms of the type that can be used. All right, so what about, you know, the clinical evidence? So I think one of the neat things about this is that it is, you know, it's in peer-reviewed journals. It has been studied properly. Sometimes, like, there's always these new innovations that come around in diabetes management, and, you know, a lot of times it's anecdotal, but this has been studied. And so this was actually, it's called a left-in-car simulation. And basically, you know, the car got up to 136 degrees Fahrenheit, which is quite hot, but, you know, can happen in the summer where a car gets that hot. And so this is actually comparing three things. It's comparing a pen that has nothing on it. And that's what this first, hopefully you can see my pointer. That's what this first one is. And you can see, you know, the temperature, we're really within 60 minutes already, 90 minutes, it's exceeded that threshold. Now, this is kind of interesting, actually. The second one is the Frio bag. So the Frio device is like one of these, it's this device where you essentially, you get it wet and then it keeps it cool. It's interesting because that really by 180 minutes, by 3 hours, also it exceeded the top temperature. And then what you can see, the bottom one is the VIVI CAP. And so even already by, you know, 480 minutes, like it was still below that threshold. And it's a pretty, you know, hot temperature. So I think that's, you know, very reassuring. So with that, I want to go back to our cases that we talked about at the beginning. So, right, we've got Adam, our 24-year-old male with type 1 diabetes, who's wearing CGM, and he's using the pens to manage his diabetes. And, you know, what could he do with his insulin the next time that he goes to the beach? You know, he wants to have a good time. He wants to lay out at the beach. He doesn't, you know, he wants to have his insulin nearby because he has type 1 diabetes. What if he needs to take his insulin? So, I mean, I personally think that, you know, the VIVI CAP could be a good option for him. So he doesn't have to worry about the insulin overheating and then making the difficult decisions about throwing away his insulin, rationing his insulin, using insulin that is not potent. So similar, let's go back to Julia, right? She's our 45-year-old woman with type 2 diabetes that is taking multiple daily injections through insulin pens. And, you know, she's following her diabetes team and what they're saying, and she takes her diabetes stuff everywhere so she can check her blood sugar. She can take insulin if she needs it. And she's trying to do all the right things. She's exercising and going to the forest preserve. And, you know, what could she do next time, right? If she's in that situation. So hopefully, you know, she can also get a VIVI CAP, right? And then she can keep her insulin in the car and not have to worry about that. So really to wrap it all up today, hopefully you've been able to see that there's several factors that impact glucose levels, and, you know, including food, different medications, physical activity, stress, lots of different things can impact it. And we spend so much time adjusting insulin doses based on these factors. I mean, I follow up with patients. Sometimes I'm doing weekly adjustments because there's so many changes. But I think we often forget that insulin storage also greatly impacts the potency and the accuracy of insulin dosing. And so that's got to be on our differential for when we're managing patients. And the consequences of inadequate insulin storage, you know, can include that glycemic variability, wasted or ineffective insulin, diabetic ketoacidosis, and even diabetes distress. Now, if the potency and accuracy of insulin are affected, it is very difficult to achieve glycemic targets, which are important to reduce and prevent those diabetes-related complications that we talked about in the beginning. And VIVI CAP, I think, offers an insulin storage solution that does help people like Adam and Julia do the things they love without experiencing these complications. And so with that, I want to leave you with just, there is, the VIVI CAP is available to order now. It's an FDA registered medical device. So it is clear through the FDA. Patients can actually order it directly without a prescription. It is $90 and there's free shipping. it is reusable and will work for a year. So this isn't the kind of thing like where you're asking someone to invest every month, you know, or even every year. This is something that will work for years, and I think will be a very good option for many people. So I've included a couple links. I'm sure Jonathan will share these with you later too. You can order directly on Amazon. Also, you can order through myvivi.com. And then also what's really nice, you know, we know a lot of people are struggling. And so for those that do struggle, especially with the cost of insulin and different things, there is a program to save 35%. And so you can see that you can register for that by emailing this email here. And so with that, you know, I am happy to take any questions here. At least I included my contact information on the last slide. So I'm very happy to take any questions. And I just want to thank you all for listening today. Thanks. And it looks like some questions did come through. So I'm going to go ahead and try to answer them because I think Jonathan was having some trouble with his sound. So one was, is there a recording of this presentation? And yes, it is recorded. So you'll be able to listen to it later, anything that you missed. Oh, this is a very good question. Does the VIVI CAP work with companion medicals in pen device? So it currently doesn't, but I also really like the InPen, and so I am hopeful that it will be compatible in the future, and that we can pursue that. So it's a great question. Let's see, reimbursement issues, commercial and Medicare, is it considered script or durable item? So right now, this is not a prescription. This is ordered through you know, through Amazon and through ViviCap. So that's what would be kind of how you would go ahead and order it right now. So unfortunately, there's not reimbursement, but it's a one-time cost, and there is that savings program. So, and then how many years maximum does it last? So it is, it will work for years and years. It is actually a minimum, you know, it's guaranteed to last for a year, but really the nice thing about it is the light. You can tell by the light if it's still working. And so if the light, you know, you press it and it's not turning on, then you know it's not working anymore, but it really will work for many years. I am seeing on the chat, it's saying it is TSA cleared. So I want to make sure you all know about that as well. And let's see what else here. Is it available for insulin vials? So I believe at the moment you can order it for pens, but I think that is definitely on the horizon. And I know Ron is in the chat too. I'm sure he can answer about that too, but I believe the vials are on the horizon to be able to be ordered. And let's see what else. Will you provide diabetes educators with a sample? So I don't know if I should speak for Ron, but I think that he will. I know he provided me with samples, which I really appreciate. And I think providing with diabetes educators is really great to do because they're often the ones teaching patients about what's new out there and what they can use. And let's see what else. So this is an interesting question. So just curious, what would you tell your patients if their insulin is left in extreme cold or hot conditions, tossing them away, continue using and keep checking glucose? So I have to say, I mean, the right answer is that they should toss it away because it's not going to be as effective and you can't guarantee the potency of it. Real life, I mean, if it comes to life and death where my patient can't get more insulin and can't afford more insulin, we might have to work with that, but it's really not safe. It's not a best practice to do at all. It can be very dangerous. So that is a very good question. And let's see, what could be happening when 10 days after starting Fiasp and it's been stored correctly, it gets cloudy and has lumps? So anytime an insulin has lumps in it, in that situation, 100%, I would discard it because insulin should not have lumps in it. And that is pretty concerning. So unfortunately, in that situation, I would definitely discard it. Let's see what else. And I think actually that's another interesting point that came up because, you know, most of our insulins now are clear with the exception of NPH and then mixes like, you know, Novolin 70/30, Humulin 70/30. And I find, you know, many patients aren't even aware that they're supposed to mix those types of insulins. And that gets into a whole other thing, right, with kind of the insulin dosing and stuff. So I think I addressed most of the questions. There was just one other question, it looks like. how quickly does insulin degrade in your car storage scenario. So I think one of the things to understand is that it's a spectrum. So, technically you don't want insulin to be, at too extreme of a temperature, even for 1 minute. But if it's just 1 minute, right, it probably is going to be okay, right? Like maybe you've lost 0.001% potency, like you've lost but the longer it is, the more you're going to lose. So, when it increases to 5 minutes or 10 minutes or an hour, I think that's when you really have to worry about it. And I think, unfortunately, there's so many variables that it's hard to say exactly how much potency is lost, because it's going to depend a lot too on, the exact heat, the exact temperature that it got. Also, like, was there direct sunlight directly on there? So I think the one thing we know is it's not ideal. It is very, very far from ideal at all. And I'm seeing Ron said that he showed that in a study, it lost 5% potency within 4 hours. So that was one study. So, but again, it'll definitely matter a lot on the temperature and all those types of things. So, so let's see. And I think, after this, we definitely would be happy. We could probably put together like a Q&A, and happy to share any resources and answer any additional questions. You guys have my email here. So you're welcome to definitely email me afterwards, and I'm happy to talk with you. Or direct you to Jonathan and Ron if it's something that I don't know. So I think, this is an interesting question. Will there be a device in the future for keeping insulin and insulin pumps in a stable temperature? I would say stay tuned. That's a good idea. All right, so I think with that, I feel like we've addressed a lot of the questions. So feel free to email me any additional questions. I want to thank you so much for attending today. And yeah, we will be in touch, and this recording will be available if you want to share it with anybody. Thank you.